Texas's Anti-Red Flag Act. A new proposed bill in Texas would block state and local entities from recognizing and enforcing extreme risk protective orders, commonly referred to as red flag laws. Red flag laws allow law enforcement, per a judge's order, to confiscate firearms from anyone they believe is at risk of committing a crime. State Rep Briscoe Cain, who authorized the measure, issued a statement saying, "The bill is about standing up for the constitutional rights of Texans, ensuring the citizens are not stripped of their rights without due process." This bill is a clear message that Texas will not bow to federal overreach and will always protect the freedoms guaranteed by our constitutions. What are your thoughts on a bill like that, or just red flag laws in general?
Totally against them. Totally against them because it's based on loose interpretation. It's a violation of your Fourth Amendment rights. It's for sure going to lead to major catastrophic circumstances, to include veterans like me and you being microanalyzed and then deemed potentially somebody who can't own firearms because a diagnosis that we had no choice in. I mean, I didn't. We talked about this openly. I'm diagnosed with post-traumatic stress because of TBI. I had to negotiate with a counselor and a psychologist. And the counselor was the one making the interpretation from the psychologist, because I said, I will not accept that I have post-traumatic stress, because there are many people who have PTS who need help. And so I could sit here and tell you right now my history. We can go through it. I could tell you all the things that I am and am not. I got good introspect from my experience and how I feel, and I'm not going to hide anything. But to just loosely diagnose me with post-traumatic stress because of my combat rotations, I don't agree with that. So they said, okay, because you have traumatic brain injury, it could lead to, and I'm like, whatever, man, whatever you want to line it out to be. Well, later on in my life, that's even applying for things like positions for head of security for the energy grid in Colorado. My career and my experience has been used against me. And so this idea that like the HIPAA laws are going to protect that, it's completely wide open now, and it's become acceptable for it to be more transparent for some reason. And I find a huge problem with that, because there are many veterans who want to keep their experience and their diagnosis private, which I think they should have the right to. Now you have federal entities that are going to come in and potentially determine on their own, based on a criteria, hey, take every veteran who's got post-traumatic stress, red flag them. Every one of those, we have to do an evaluation. If we don't agree with it, they can no longer own firearms. What? So the person that you sent to war to fight your battles comes back, has diagnosis, in some cases mandatory because of their service, and now you're saying the person you sent to serve with the firearm now can't protect themselves because they can't own a firearm, just like a felon can't own a firearm. I don't agree with that. And I think the biggest problem I have is the idea that government can loosely interpret anything. I mean, what's the stipulations for their interpretation? Is it going to be post-traumatic stress? Is it going to be a psychological event? Who do you determine is crazy? Like the idea that like, hey, there was a lot of things that we should have paid attention to. So if a guy comes in and says, hey, I'm having mental health issues, you take his guns? I mean, because that's what you're prospecting. So I don't like it at all. And I think you have a personal experience where you dealt with some stuff with your flight physical.
Oh, I'm not done yet. I'm 6 months into it and probably almost $20,000 and nowhere near being finished.
Tell people about that, because that's exactly the same thing, just in a different field of expertise.
So in a nutshell, years ago, from what I have been told, the VA reached out to the FAA and said, we believe we have veteran aviators who were not completely transparent in their disability ratings, who did not disclose the conditions that they are receiving compensation for on their flight physicals. So they, and again, this is from what I have been told by many people who've been caught up in this, immediately flagged a review of all veteran aviators, because for whatever reason, the FAA and VA are allowed to share this information and it doesn't violate HIPAA, even though your compensation and pension record and your VA rating should be not the rating itself, but I think the vast majority of it is privileged information. So I know people who were grounded for years. I know people who lost their jobs because of this. I have been told stories of people who ended their life because their livelihood ground to an absolute halt. I know of at least one person specifically that was prosecuted by the FAA, and they have an ability to lean on the veteran aviator because they have access to those records. And it's a level of scrutiny that they are not applying to the remainder of people out there in private, corporate, professional aviation. Having said all of that, you'll know you're not going to find somebody who agrees more with safety of flight than myself. I don't think unsafe people should be out there flying. But if we're going to put people into a vice, we should do it equally, not just because you may have access to a federal system that you can overlay these records. So, I have had to go to a specialist to justify out of my own pocket every single rating that shows up on my C&P paperwork, compensation and pension paperwork, to include the ones that are rated at 0%. And where I live in Montana, there's not a lot of FAA evaluators that can do this. So I have had to travel to do this or do this remotely, all at my own cost, all because I want to fly a helicopter around Montana. And it remains to be seen. I'll probably won't hear back again from the FAA for another 30 to 45 days. And the last time I heard from them, they wanted one letter became two requests. I responded to that. Two requests became four. I don't know if this is going to be here's your medical, you'll never fly again, or we need to see more specialists. But it is unbelievable.
Good morning, everybody. As you know, Change Agents is an Ironclad original, but what you may not know is that for over a decade, Ironclad has worked with brands and individuals to create world-class films, series, podcasts, and ad campaigns. In fact, I've been working with Ironclad for the past few years. I was introduced to them on a project through the Navy SEAL Foundation. I've worked with them on a variety of projects, even up here in Montana, long before they proposed the idea of Change Agents to me. They're the best in their field. And I say that because there are plenty of people out there looking for the best, looking for the cream of the crop, looking for the top of the triangle. And if you're looking for that, you need to look no further than Ironclad. If you ever need media by way of film, a series, podcasts, or ad campaigns, they have you covered.
So they haven't grounded you as of yet.
It's pending.
But there's a potential that they
Sure.
could, because they could say, "Hey,"
They could deny my
I think,
medical.
yeah, that's what seems to be the problem. It seems to be like, well, we're going to throw up obstacles to be able to potentially stop people that we determine based on our opinion. Like no law, no case law, no precedent, just based on our opinion, we're going to shut these aviators down. And when you go to apply to be a commercial pilot, most commercial pilots are former military aviators because they have a vast more experience with thousands of hours
I
to
wouldn't say
meet the
most.
minimum requirement,
I wouldn't
right?
say I wouldn't say most. Actually, of all the people in the United States that are aviators, veterans are a super small minority of that, just because there's
Mhm.
more people. You know what I mean? Most people haven't served in the military. Um, yeah, it's I had to go see a psychiatrist for a full psychiatric workup. I had to go see a psychologist for a full psychological workup. I had to do a complete half-day testing, psychological screening test. I had to go get my eyes done. I had to go, see a general, uh, a practitioner. They wanted every record from my stomach surgery, when you came and visited me in American Fork and everything else in between. So it's been interesting, and at the end of the day, yeah, they could just say, "Hey, you'll never fly again." So,
That's wild, man. That kind of legislation needs to be brought up, especially protecting veterans.
yep.
That's the kind of things that these flag laws enact. I mean, again, I don't know how this correlated with the gun world, but the red flag world is just a loose interpretation of potentially creating more obstacles to people exercising their rights as citizens. I mean, it's scary because
Well,
there's
flying
no
isn't a right.
limit.
So one thing on that note, flying isn't a right. You know what I mean? It's a privilege. So they do have the ability to do it. Do I agree with the system? Absolutely not. Do I agree with the fact that they can squeeze military aviators in this way because they have access to their records while the vast majority of other pilots they can't? And here's the thing too. I mean, I in the years that I've been involved in aviation, I've met a lot of people inside of the FAA, and I have been told straight up by people still working for the FAA that they were not honest on their FAA medical form because the fear is you're going to lose your ability to fly. So they don't check a box. here and there. Like, I get it. The difference is the FAA doesn't have the ability to put them into a vice by compelling their records like they do for the military. So it remains to be seen. What I will say this, I'm going to correct you on one thing. You do have post-traumatic stress, and so do I. Let me ask you, and here's how, let me quantify this. Are you the same person that you were when you joined the military now?
No, for sure.
Neither,
Not for sure. Not. Yeah.
neither am I. And the job that we were exposed to was stressful, and there oftentimes were or was trauma involved. What I think, though, is that if you don't experience that trauma and you don't experience that stress, and then what I would say from that is growth, then you have an issue. So, like, if you get sick and you don't get a fever, that is your body not managing itself appropriately, right? If you get sick, you're going to get a fever. So, if you're exposed to combat, you're going to have stress, likely traumatic stress. And by the way, for everybody listening, I'm not a fucking psychiatrist or psychologist or a therapist. I'm just trying to talk through my own experience here. You're exposed to that stress, your body deals with it naturally, and we're able to grow from it. I think I am a better version of myself because of my military experiences. And I've known you long enough. I think you would say the same thing. So for us, we had the normal reaction to post-traumatic stress. Event, exposed to trauma, our body was able to work through it, and we evolved as a person. Post-traumatic growth is what I wish we would focus on. But there is a group of people that is unable to do that, and those experiences can break them. And that's where the disorder comes in, right? Your body not being able to process it. So I don't think we have, I wouldn't say you and I have PTSD. I would say we were exposed to post-traumatic stress. And the system that we were a part of that rates us on the tail end of that is just not nuanced enough to be able to parse those two things. But we were absolutely exposed to trauma. We were absolutely exposed to stress. And post those events, there was a change in us that made us a different version of who we were before. So I don't think it's a bad thing unless you are stuck in that cycle and you can't get your way out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. The bad thing is, I think the stigma that's tethered to it, where the military looks at PTS, especially on active service, and not as part of a retirement or getting out process, as you can no longer do anything. You know, you're incapable or unable.
That's a
to do your
misunderstanding
job.
of that, but so that's a misunderstanding of the VA system though as well. There is a rating, and I don't know it off the top of my head. Like, I'm 100% permanent in total, and nowhere in the doctrine associated with that rating anywhere does it say that I am not supposed to live my most fulfilled life. I am not supposed to try to be as active as possible. It doesn't say any of those things. There's an additional rating that you can be applied if you are unable to do those things. So there's two separate things. It's a vast misunderstanding of what the VA system actually is. And perhaps they may need, I mean, what might help is changing the vernacular away from disability and calling it compensation. You know what I mean? Or something along those lines. Because, yeah, when you hear the word disabled, I mean, I think naturally everybody goes, oh shit, what's wrong with that person? What can they not do?
Yeah, that's a weird one. I think you're right. I think the language needs to change because we've talked about it before. I know I have post traumatic stress, but I also know at the time in which I was transitioning, trying to get a full time job with the CIA, I didn't want that on my record.
Yeah.
Because I was in fear that if that was on my record and the CIA saw it, they would shut me down and be like, hey, this is a problem. Just as we have these issues with, like the FAA looking into your medical records. It's like all of this is based on interpretation from a stigma that's tethered to veterans that seems like a disorder or seems like a disability, when there needs to be a more broader conversation. Like, when people ask me, like, oh, you're 100% total and permanent disabled, like, what does that mean? And I'm like, well, I just have a rating and a culmination of injuries and issues. And then they say, oh, do you have post-traumatic stress? I'm like, well, that's part of it, but that's one part. That's 1/15th of the issue of all the 15 issues that I have that cumulatively was above and beyond the even 100% disability rating that made me total and permanent. And if they hear that you got post-traumatic stress immediately, like you said, it's a stigma. And that's probably where the focus needs to be. It's like, before we get to a position where a GS-9 is signing off on paperwork to send to a judge to get a warrant or to get somebody's firearm seized because they just checked the block on a form. Does this person have post-traumatic stress? Did they have mental health issue? Whatever it is, we need to have those broader conversations to kind of articulate what that even means. I mean, we talk about it all the time, but like, I mean, that's the issue with the government. They're not taking and weighing all these considerations. They might just be looking at a form or having a brief conversation before they go take a veteran's firearms.
Yeah, I'm not a fan of the term red flag laws. Um, it just I don't like the term in general. I would love for there to be an ability. Well, for one, let's say the red flag laws are in effect. I just don't know if you would ever be able to get your firearms back. You would be in such an uphill battle trying to fight your way back to that constitutional right. That's one of my main concerns. I wish, I mean, and this is not, I don't think this is something you can codify, but you and I both know people who have reached out to friends and said to them, "Hey man, I need you to come get my guns." I don't know how you do that at a national or a state level. And there's a lot of times where that fails. I would love for there to be some metric, but I just don't think it's a government entity. Some metric where instead of the person reaching out, a close friend, whether it's even just directly contacting that person and being like, "Hey, are you okay? Why don't you let me hold your guns for this time period," or an NGO or something like that. You know what I mean? That doesn't necessarily involve the government. That is a mechanism there because even this, the term red flag itself, that's going to turn off. That's going to have an allergic reaction for most people anyway.
Yeah, it's like you popped up on the radar
Yeah.
because you got an issue, you got a problem. It's like, oh, I didn't know I had a problem just because I have a diagnosis of post-traumatic stress potentially. I mean, I think the red flag laws um, might have originated with integrity, but nobody can define what it means. I
Yeah.
mean, and then nobody can outline the structure of when somebody is red flagged. And
Or
that's, I
when,
think
or
that's
how
the
they get off.
complication.
There needs to
Yeah.
be
How do you, yeah.
there needs to
How
be
do you
the
work
tail end as
yourself out
well.
of it?
How do you get
Yeah.
on this list? Then also, what is the clear path to getting off of this list? Because if there is no clear path, good luck having anybody institute this.
Yeah, but my favorite is on in reflection. They said where they were displaying the warning signs. Okay, what were the warning signs? Where they were exuding behavior that was just not normal. Okay, does that mean you need to be investigated and arrested and put in jail? Like, there's no crime that's committed. So how about that's like everybody who has issues just in life in general will have an up and down, and in their down cycle, it might be behavior that's unbecoming, where you're like, that's not normal for that person. That doesn't mean they're going to conduct a mass shooting or go out and self-harm or go out and purchase a firearm to do harm. It's like that's not good enough. So it's like, what's the parameters? Because there are totally rational, reasonable human beings that do dumb things, including commit acts of violence. And there's complete lunatics like Jordan Neely, who was arrested 44 times, who had mental health issues, drug issues, and nobody helped him, including the systems in place that were supposed to help. And he threatens to kill people on a subway station. So it's like, man, it's such a convolution of errors and issues that need to be navigated, to be figured out.
I hope that I'm going to look into whether or not Utah has a red flag law because I am going to anonymously report you.
I already reported you to Montana. That's why you're doing the whole medical screening for the
Montana
aviation.
doesn't give a shit. They're like, yeah, we'll give him a ticket if he doesn't have guns.
I was like, how dare Andy have fun flying a helicopter? I'm calling the FAA.